On October 6, 2012, Lori Dalton called the police and requested a welfare check on her neighbor, 58-year-old Gail Spencer. The neighbors regularly took care of each other's pets, and Lori was expecting Gail to let her dog in the house when she got home from work on the 5th, since Lori and her husband were out of town and wouldn't be home until early the next morning. When the Daltons returned home and found their dog still outside, they knocked on Gail's door but didn't get an answer. They also noticed that the windows were fogged up, like it was really cold inside, and they knew Gail to be the type of person who was generally cold by nature and rarely used her air conditioning. On top of that, all the blinds were closed, but the lights were on, which also seemed strange to the neighbors. When the officer arrived on the scene at about 3 a.m., he also knocked on the front and back doors but got no answer. The neighbors shared keys with each other, but it sounds like the deadbolt to Gail's house was locked and the neighbor's key didn't work on that lock. They said she didn't normally lock the deadbolt. So the fire department arrived on the scene and was able to unlock a window and make entry into the house. That was when they found Gail in her bedroom lying on the bed with a plastic bag over her head. Detectives entered through the kitchen at the back of the house. The kitchen and living room were noted to be clean and orderly, not appearing to have been ransacked. A set of keys to an Acura was found on a small table. The bifold doors to the hallway closet were open, with one of them off the track. There were papers scattered on the floor in front of the closet. The hallway bathroom had papers scattered on the floor. There were also 3 empty pill bottles on the bathroom floor. One was an old bottle of Darvocet and the other were 2 older bottles of hydrocodone. There was an empty bottle of Clorox bleach on the floor between the vanity and the toilet. There was also an empty bottle of Clorox cleaning spray on the bathroom counter. In the bedroom, clothes from the closet had been pulled out and thrown on the floor. There were multiple bottles of alcohol in the bedroom, as well as a wine glass and a shot glass. In the master bathroom, there were credit cards and papers scattered on the floor. There was an RG-14 .22 caliber revolver on the counter with the retaining rod for the cylinder removed. The rod was sitting on the counter on the opposite side of the sink. It was extremely cold in the house, and investigators discovered the thermostat had been turned all the way down and the AC had been running continuously. A preliminary look at the body found no visible signs of trauma. To the untrained eye, the scene could have been mistaken for a suicide. Gail could have taken drugs with booze and put a bag over her own head to suffocate after losing consciousness, but the detectives knew that wasn't the case. When the detectives were finished searching the house, there were some notable items missing. Her vehicle, a 2004 Acura, was missing. It wasn't parked in the garage and wasn't in the driveway. Her cell phone and her wallet were also missing, which would be weird if she had taken her own life. Most importantly, Gail had no reason to kill herself. She had a son and 2 grandkids. She had a good job and wasn't in a bunch of debt. She hadn't ever been in trouble with the law. No, Gail had been killed by someone else, and investigators would quickly learn that it was all based on a convoluted plan for a handful of people to get rich without working for it. This is Monsters. Tracy Jones was born in 1974 in Georgia. Not much is known about her childhood, but she was partly raised by her grandmother in a farmhouse near Lake Tobosoffke, just west of Macon, Georgia. According to her grandmother, Tracy had been a good girl and the family had no clue how things had gone wrong. Tracy had been married multiple times, but all I know is that she mentioned her quote-unquote third husband in one of her interviews. She ultimately had 2 sons, 17-year-old Scott and 15-year-old Dominic. In 2012, Tracy was single and living in an apartment with her 2 sons. She had experience working as a legal secretary and began working at Pinkston & Associates in 2011. Founded by Calder Pinkston, the company was a law firm that specialized in real estate law. Tracy was hired on to handle general office work, and it was there that she met a woman named Gail Spencer. Part of what happens in real estate is called escrow. When money is exchanged for goods or services, you can use an escrow service in order to ensure the money is paid and the service is fulfilled without one party getting scammed. The payer will put the money in escrow, then when they get their goods or services, the escrow company will pay the money to the payee. It's more common for larger amounts of money, especially when it comes to real estate. So Pinkston and Associates would handle large sums of money as part of their escrow service. Gail handled transferring those sums of money to the sellers after the real estate transaction had closed. Calder Pinkston would later explain to the investigators that they generally provided payments to sellers by check and didn't normally wire transfer the money into their account, though that method was possible. After Gail's body was found, investigators talked to her family and her coworkers. When they interviewed Patsy Miller, another Pinkston employee, she explained that Tracy had come into work late on the morning of Friday, October 5th. When she arrived, she said she was giving her friend a ride, and on the way back her car broke down. According to Patsy, Tracy claimed that she started walking around and knocking on random doors, looking for help, and she just happened to stumble onto Gail's house. She made it sound like Tracy had no idea that Gail lived in the area and was surprised when she opened the door. That would make Tracy the last person to see Gail alive, and when she was brought in for an interview, this was her story.
I got up and I told my work that I had to drop a friend off, but the thing is I take Lortabs and I didn't have any. Mm-hmm. And a friend of mine had told me that there was this guy on Holly Mill that sold Lortabs. Mm-hmm. So I figured I'd drive over there, see if they were up, see if I could buy some. So when I pulled down the road, there was no lights on, so I turned my car off and then kind of, I've never been there before, so I kind of got a little scared, turned my car off, just sat there for a minute. And I went and turned my car back on, and I guess the battery cable was loose, and it wouldn't crank back up. And so I sat there for a little bit, and I knew Gail lived there, so I walked over there, and she came to the door, and I asked her if I had to have something to drink, and I had to pee really bad, so I went and peed. I peed first, and then I went in there and fixed me something to drink. She said, well, I got to get ready. She really didn't act like she wanted to talk to me much. So I went in the kitchen and I fixed me something to drink, and I said, well, I'm going to go try my thing again, because if I wiggle it, I can probably get it to crank. Mm-hmm. Well, she had shut the door, so I'm hollering at her through the door, and I said, if I don't come back, you'll know I got it crunk. If I come back, you might need to take me home. And she said, okay. And I walked back to my car and messed with it and got it crunk, and I left.
Who was with you?
I was by myself.
You were by yourself? Mm-hmm. Okay. And you were going to Holly Mills?
Mm-hmm. I think that's the name of that road, Holly Mill Holly, something like that. They told me it was the third house on the right.
Who's they?
A friend of mine.
Who's the friend?
They told me this like a long time ago. I just never
Who's the
had the
friend's
nerve.
name?
Excuse me?
Friend's name?
Brandy. Her name's Brandy.
Brandy what?
Fulford.
Not to spell her last name?
Fulford. Fulford.
Okay. Did you call her that morning?
No.
Okay.
I just figured I'd take a chance, but I chickened out. I couldn't get to the door.
What house?
Which house?
They said the third house on the right, is what she had told me.
Tracy's story did not match her coworkers. Here, she admitted to lying about giving her friend a ride. She said she was looking to buy Lortabs, which is a combination of the opioid painkiller hydrocodone and the non-opioid pain reliever acetaminophen, which is commonly known as Tylenol in the US and Canada and paracetamol in other places. On top of that, she claimed to have known exactly where Gail lived. She went on to tell the detectives that she had been to Gail's house before and they had hung out outside of work a few times, but she hadn't been there in a few months. She described Gail being in a hurry to get ready for work and that she didn't really see her much. She used the bathroom, got a drink of water, and left. She was able to get her car crunk, as she described, and the detectives were interested in what was wrong with her car. She explained that she thought the battery cable was loose.
When your car broke down, How did you know it could be the battery cable?
Because it does it often.
Then why didn't you check it right then?
Well, because I had really thought about going to the house, and a lot of times if you just let it sit there for some reason, I don't know, if I just kept trying, it won't do. And I was kind of scared Gail had saw me ride by or something and be like, well, what is she doing over here? You know what I mean?
Why would you care?
Because I didn't want her to know I was going to buy blower tabs.
Well, she wouldn't have known.
She would have asked me what I was doing over there.
I was driving by seeing a friend.
Well, I know, but I didn't.
Tracy is only being questioned as a witness, having been the last person known to have seen Gail. At this point, authorities don't have any reason to believe she was involved, but will end up reporting that they found her story very suspicious. Most people who think their battery cable is loose will just pop the hood, wiggle the cable, and then start the car. But I get that not everyone has an understanding of how to fix a problem like that. So you could shrug that off, but when she described being worried about Gail having seen her, she made her story sound more suspicious. First, she doesn't want Gail to know she was buying drugs and said she might ask her what she was doing in that area. Why wouldn't she just say she was giving her friend a ride, the exact same thing she had just told her employer? And then, having gone to Gail's house, didn't do anything to explain why she was in the area. Her car broke down nearby, but why was she in the area in the first place? Why did showing up at Gail's house solve that problem? It didn't. Also, the way Gail's house is set up, it's set pretty far back from the main road and seems very unlikely she would have seen Tracy drive by and recognize it was her or her car. Her story of being friends with Gail also didn't match what other employees of Pinkston told investigators. They said that the two didn't get along and Gail regularly complained about Tracy being late for work and not completing tasks properly. Oftentimes, Gail would have to redo Tracy's subpar work. Tracy explained that, after she left Gail's house, she drove back home, got ready for work, took her younger son Dominic to school, and then went to work. She said at some point during her interviews that her older son Scott didn't go to school, and I don't know if he graduated early or dropped out. It's not really relevant outside of the fact that he was home at the apartment that day. Coworkers eventually became concerned when Gail didn't show up for work. She was a very dedicated and responsible employee, never having been late and rarely calling in sick. That worry didn't seem to make them immediately suspicious of Tracy. She was unreliable, but most people wouldn't immediately think their coworker was a murderer. They did give investigators another piece of information that would help them figure out exactly what had happened. Patsy Miller told the detectives that Tracy had called in sick on Thursday the 4th, the day before Gail's murder. Being nosy, she and Gail went into Tracy's office to poke around and they found a sticky note right on her desk. On the note was the address 233 Peachtree Street in Atlanta and the name Michael Brett Kelly. Patsy said they looked up the address and it was to an expedited passport service. Both of those things piqued the curiosity of the investigators, so they brought Tracy in for another interview the following day. That wasn't the only time they heard Michael Brett Kelly's name, though. Near the beginning of the investigation, a young man from the area called in saying Brett had asked him if he wanted to leave the country. Brett went on to explain that he knew an old lady they could get $1 million out of if they just held her hostage for a day. The friend didn't get involved, and when he heard about the murder, he informed the police of what he knew. When Tracy came in for her second interview, detectives asked her to go over what she had done on the 5th again. It's a common tactic to see if any of the suspect's story changed. It hadn't, but what I noticed was that, as she told the story, she added the details that were answers to the detectives' questions the prior day. For example, she said she chickened out of going to the drug dealer's house, and so she went to Gail's house because she knew she lived near there and that she was afraid she had seen her drive by.
What business is at 233 Peachtree Street, Atlanta, Georgia?
It's a passport place.
Why would you need a passport place?
Because I would like to go out of town one day.
Out of town?
Yeah.
One day?
Mm-hmm. I plan on me and my kids and going to the Bahamas or somewhere as soon as we can, just for a couple of days.
Are you aware that it's an expedited passport place?
No, what does that mean?
That means they do it fast.
Oh.
2 weeks,
Boom.
and it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, I understand.
You know, you can get a passport at CVS.
Yeah.
No,
Walgreens.
I didn't know you could just go in.
Yeah,
and
it just
get
takes
one.
longer, and it only costs a little bit of money.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
When did you contact this passport place?
I don't know. One day last week.
One day last week.
You don't remember what day?
No, I don't remember what day.
Who'd you speak to?
What do you mean? Who did I speak to? I called them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And who all was planning on going with you on this trip?
Well, I want to take my boys, but there's some things I have to get their daddy to do.
Who's
So-
their daddy?
Leonard Scott Daniel.
Leonard Scott Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, why would Brett's name be involved in it?
Because him and my son are very good friends, and he wanted to go with us.
You said one day. You're talking like it's going to be next week.
Well, I mean,
Tracy.
I would like to go soon, to be
You don't know if
honest
that
with you.
boy next. I mean, you're talking about one day. You said no. You said one day, Tracy. You said one day. Now, if I tell him one day, I'd like to get married. That could be a
5
year,
years
5,
from now.
10 years from now. But I'm not going to go out and buy an engagement ring.
You're taking my words and you're protruding them.
We're telling you exactly how we take it. All right.
That's what you told us. I'm
That's what
just
you
repeated
said.
exactly back to you. I just said you said one day. That doesn't mean next week. If you were going to go next week or next month or even a year, then you would have said, well, we're getting ready. We have plans just like people do on a cruise. Well, next year we're going to go on a cruise. But you said one day. One day. And then you said, Brett, one day I'm going to take Brett. Do you see, Tracy, it's not adding up. Everything's
I completely understand. It's not adding up. I completely do. But I've told y'all everything. I've
No.
told you everything.
No, Tracy, you haven't.
Yes, I have.
No.
Okay.
Right off the bat, I will tell you that the detective was wrong. You cannot get a U.S. passport from a drugstore like CVS or Walgreens. They only do passport photos. You have to take those photos with you to apply for a passport at a handful of places that are able to do that, like the post office or a courthouse. So just getting that out of the way. The address Kelly had was for a service that helps someone get a passport quickly. Say you have family in another country and one of them gets sick or has an accident and you want to get to them quickly. You would use an expedited passport service because the normal application process can take 4 to 6 weeks or longer if there's a sudden surge in passport applications. You can even pay a little extra for an expedited passport yourself, which will bump you to the front of the line and will only take 2 to 3 weeks. And you can do that anywhere you would normally apply for a passport. But it sounds like Tracy and her co-conspirators were able to get passports in a matter of days, which requires you to go to a specialized passport office to be interviewed, and it seems like you need to have a reason why you need the passport so quickly. But it's unknown what she might have told the person at the passport office. Now that process is absolutely not what you would do to just get a passport to go on a trip to the Bahamas someday. There are many places in Macon where you can get a passport and even pay for an expedited passport. You would need to do research on getting a passport within days in order to come up with that specific business over an hour away as the place you need to go to get a passport. And she called into work, lied about being sick to take a day off from work in order to go up there and get it. That's not the behavior of someone who just wants a passport so they can maybe go on a trip out of the country someday, maybe. That's why she wasn't at work the day before the murder. That's the point in the story when Brett came into the picture. 18-year-old Michael Brett Kelly, who went by Brett, was Tracy's older son's friend, and it turned out that he had been living at Tracy's apartment with her and her sons. Oh, and they were having sex. When the detective asked about him, since he had also applied for a passport, she claimed that he was going to go with them on this trip out of the country that might happen someday, maybe. But even that wasn't the weirdest part of the story.
Who all was with y'all? I know there was more than just you and Brett.
It was me, Brett, and his sister.
Who's his sister?
Courtney.
Courtney who?
Kelly.
Courtney Kelly?
Mm-hmm.
How about a Shelley Kelly?
I don't know no Shelley Kelly.
Did you see one? Okay.
I understand.
Now, why would he go up there and get a passport for Canada that day?
I don't know. I didn't know that he got one for Canada.
You were there?
Yeah, I was there, but I didn't. I mean, when you get a passport, I didn't realize it had where you were going.
There is no way, Tracy, that you're going to drive someone to Atlanta to get a passport and not know where they're going. Just out of curiosity, if I took this man to Atlanta, if he said to me, hey, can you take me up to Atlanta to get a passport? All right? There's going to be a conversation at some point. Where are you going?
Where are you going? What you doing?
Yeah.
Because I just told you that. We were all planning on going somewhere.
Where?
I just told you. Okay. Come on.
You haven't told us where.
No.
I told you I want either we're Mexico or we can take a
Those
cruise.
are just a bunch of. That's just.
You're just having off names.
You just naming
Exactly.
stuff.
So when I go get my kids' passports, we can just get up and go if we want to. It ain't got to be no rigmarole.
I just asked you, where did you get the passport for? And you said you did not.
No, I told you a minute ago, so we could all go together. No, where he was good. I didn't know you could get a passport and say, okay, I need a passport to go to such and such.
Tracy,
What?
let me just be blunt with you. You're full of shit.
Okay.
And there isn't anybody in this room that believes you.
Okay.
Brett's half-sister, 23-year-old Courtney Kelly, also went with them over an hour away to get expedited passports, because apparently she was also going to go with them on their mystery trip. I'm not sure what their experience was in obtaining passports. You don't normally have to put a destination in on the passport application, but there are different rules for an expedited passport. Brett may have said he needed to be in Canada soon just to fulfill the requirements of that. I'm not sure. Tracy's lack of knowledge about what Brett planned to use his passport for was suspicious. But I want to also point out that Tracy had not applied for passports for her sons. At that time, Tracy, Brett, and Courtney had applied for passports, but in the last clip, Tracy said she was getting their passports ready so when she finally got her kids' passports, they could just go. Why not get them all at the same time? It doesn't make any sense, and unfortunately, the truth ends up being absolutely terrible. The next lie that would fall apart for Tracy would be her claim that her friend Brandy had told her about a man who sold lure tabs near where Gail lived.
You said earlier that if I spoke to Brandy, your friend that told you where this area lived at, right? Mm-hmm. That she would say that she did, didn't she? She gave you directions. Let me go ahead and let you know something. I had Brandy Fulford, okay, who's now Brandy Case, down here yesterday after you left.
Okay.
And Brandy says she don't have a clue what you're talking about.
Yeah, because she don't want her husband
No,
to know.
she's not gonna get herself involved in this. Okay. She said right here, says she don't have a clue what you're talking about, and she doesn't even know no Eric. Said that you guys aren't even really that close.
Oh, I know you're lying now because we're very close.
I'm not lying.
Okay. Well, she lied because we're very close. We talk almost every day.
How are you going to claim that you're super close with someone and you don't even know their current last name? Tracy had given the detectives the name Brandy Fulford, but she had gotten married and changed her last name. How are you not going to know that if you're really close with someone and supposedly talk to them all the time? I'll be honest, by the time authorities got Tracy in for a second interview, they were wrong about a lot. They didn't fully understand what Gail's murder really involved. It turned out that Tracy personally knew one of the detectives at the station, Detective Scott Chapman. It sounds like they were acquainted, maybe they knew each other in high school, but not actually good friends. He ended up coming in to try and get Tracy to tell the truth. Eventually he told Tracy to call Brett because authorities knew he was involved and he was absolutely positive that Brett would not answer the phone. But he did. While on the phone, the detective asked him to come to the station to answer some questions, and Brett agreed. Detective Chapman told Tracy that there was no way that he was going to show up at the station. But he did. When Brett arrived, Tracy was placed in a different room, and Brett ended up talking to the investigators for almost 4 hours. He started off with quite an attitude. First, they had him describe what he did all day on Thursday the 5th and Friday the 6th. He claimed that both days he was home all day. He said he was at the apartment, playing video games and smoking pot all day on both days. But the detectives already knew that was a lie.
Now, what I wanted to show you here, kiddo, is you stayed at home Thursday, right? All day Thursday. What is that right there?
Passport?
A passport.
Oh.
Mm-hmm. What does that say we're stamped at, pal? October the 4th, 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You couldn't have got your passport and it's stamped on October the 4th, 2012 if you were at Rutland Corners all day Thursday and all night Thursday.
Okay.
You're lying, Brett.
Well, I'm sticking to my story. That's all I'm going to say.
All right.
What story?
What story are you sticking to?
The one I just told you, that all the information you got right on the piece of paper.
But I've got it right here, buddy.
All right.
What do you think Tracy told us, bro?
I don't know.
Tracy already told us that she drove you up to Atlanta to get the passport, son.
All right, then why did you ask me?
Okay? What'd I tell you?
That's good.
I like it. I like it. Okay? All right. So you're lying. We already established that point.
Okay.
Now, how?
I said you established it, okay?
Right. We've established the fact that you're lying. All right? So we know that you're lying.
Okay.
So are you going to continue lying or are you going to be honest? Because you're in a world of hurt.
Okay, well,
You're in a world of hurt.
all right.
Brett was cocky and thought he knew everything, but he was quickly shown that authorities had more evidence against him than he had realized. Honestly, Detective Chapman would have probably been right about Brett not answering the phone, and especially about him not coming to the station, but he didn't realize how much Brett thought he was in the clear. Brett had no idea that he was already so close to being arrested. The detectives also handed him the statement that his friend had made about him claiming they were going to hold a woman hostage. Once he realized he was not going to get away with the crime, he claimed he would confess and then gave some vague details that didn't involve anybody else. He was obviously trying to protect his sister, but he was also trying to protect Tracy. He was still underestimating that the authorities knew he hadn't acted alone. He finally broke down and told the detective exactly what happened in Gail's house that day, for the most part.
I was dropped over there that morning.
All right.
I was dropped over there that morning. I walked in, had a pistol put it to her head, taped her up, put her on the bed. I untied her, let her go use the restroom when she asked and whatnot. And then I didn't tape her up no more because I felt sorry. I cried. I didn't want to do it. I sat there and let her sit on her bed. I let her watch TV. I let her smoke cigarettes. I did everything she wanted to do. A shot of liquor. She didn't. She just sat there. I let her do whatever she wanted. She wanted to go pee. She could do that. I didn't want to do it. At all. And then my sister was involved also. But I don't know where she's at, honestly. I don't.
That's Courtney, Kelly.
I did. I tell you.
Okay.
And then I suffocated her.
What'd you suffocate her with?
Trash bag.
Trash bag? What color was it?
No.
Was it like one that goes in a trash can, or was it a small one, like a little grocery sack? No. Okay.
And then I left.
How'd you leave?
I don't know.
I know what you took her. You took her car.
Mm-hmm. Took her car.
Did you take her wallet, Brett?
No, I didn't. I didn't touch none of that.
Did your sister? Because Gail's wallet's missing. I just want to get it back to the family.
I really didn't touch none of that. I didn't touch none. I didn't try to steal nothing.
What about her cell phone? Because it's missing.
I didn't touch that. I did not touch anything. I didn't try to steal anything.
Okay. You were in the house by yourself?
Just by myself.
But Tracy's the one that led you over there to her.
All I did was get an address.
Tracy gave you the address?
I just got an address.
All right. Because Tracy gave you the address. Tracy knew what you were going to do. Right? That's a yes, right? Okay. So I know Tracy knew what you were going to do. Was it just supposed to be a robbery, Brett, and it ended up going too far? Is that what it is?
Brett admitted what had happened, but while he did, he continually described how well he had treated Gail. You know, before he killed her. Not only that, but he wasn't completely honest. Brett had not gone to Gail's house alone, and it wasn't a robbery gone wrong. He had not gotten Gail's address and gone there on his own. Tracy had become close with Brett, and he moved in with her a few months prior to the murder. Tracy had come up with a plan to embezzle money from her employer, but Gail was in charge of those accounts, so someone would have to keep her away from the office. After more pressure, Brett admitted that he wasn't alone at Gail's house. He was there with someone he only knew as Anthony. He and Anthony were supposed to hold Gail captive while Tracy worked, logged in with Gail's password, and transferred a large sum of money into multiple accounts owned by him and his sister, Courtney.
All of this was over so that Tracy could embezzle money, so that she could transfer monies from that account to y'all's accounts. Did she transfer money in your account?
Today, she did.
And it was today, and it was $12,000. How much was it?
200 and something thousand.
She transferred $200,000 in your account?
It was 800 something thousand in my sister's.
There was $800,000 in your sister's account? Was it just those two accounts?
That's it.
Okay. All right.
Big money.
That's a lot of money, Brett. That's a lot of money. Yeah.
I did it.
It wasn't until later that the full embezzlement was realized, but on October 5th, Tracy had made 3 wire transfers in the amounts of $249,750, $429,550, and $205,250 for a total of $884,550. Those 3 transfers went into bank accounts that had been opened by Courtney. On the morning of the 9th, before she was brought back in for more questioning, Tracy made 2 more transfers, another $163,000 and then $245,000 into Brett's account. That brought their grand total to $1,292,550. That was the price that they put on Gail's life. Brett said that he had brought a gun with him and that it was a .380 pistol that he had had for a while. The revolver that was left in Gail's bathroom was hers, and when they found it, Brett took it apart to make sure it couldn't be used. He said that the day after the murder, he threw his gun off of a bridge into a river. It's never been recovered, but it was also not used, so it wasn't a blow to the case. At the end of Brett's interview, he sat in the interview room for about 40 minutes before getting on his knees and praying. That was when his father entered the room and Brett asked for a lawyer, for what good it would do him by then. While Tracy was waiting for Brett to be interviewed, she was officially placed under arrest and she told the detective she wanted a lawyer. But once Brett's interview was over, she changed her mind. So she was brought back into the room and she told the detectives her side of the story.
Miss Jones, are you willing to speak with me about the death investigation of Gail Spencer now?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Tell me everything that you know about it.
I know that I dropped off. I went to the neighborhood, and I went up to her door, and I went inside, and I left, and Brett and another guy went in the house, and they were only supposed to keep her there. That was all it. Just keep her there while I could transfer money that day, and then we were going to leave. That's how things were supposed to unfold.
So you went over there, you left the door unlocked?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's how things were supposed to unfold. She was never supposed to be killed.
Okay.
That was never a plan to kill her. That was not the plan at all.
And who are these 2 boys?
One was Brett, and I don't know the other guy's name. It's a black guy.
It is a black guy?
Yes.
So it was Brett. What's
Kelly.
Brett Kelly?
Mm-hmm.
And you don't even know the first name of this black guy?
No, I don't.
Did you drive them over there?
Yes.
You did? Where'd you drop them off at?
At the end of that road that I told you I was on.
When we initially had talked before.
Yes, sir.
Tell me, okay, so you dropped them off. Did you drive up to Gail's house, or did you walk up there?
I walked up there.
Where'd you leave your car?
Right there at that road.
At the road?
Mm-hmm.
So when you walk up to the door, what do you do?
I knocked on the door and asked her if I could use the restroom and get something to drink. And I told her exactly what I had told y'all. That
The car had broke down?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that is true.
Yes, sir.
Did you ever use her phone?
No.
Okay, so you never used her phone. So she let you in. And what happens after that?
I went in the kitchen and got something to drink. And that's when Brett and the guy came in, and I walked out the door.
Do you know what they done after that?
I have no idea. I have no idea, but the only thing that was supposed to happen was they was just supposed to keep her there. If Brett left before the black guy, I don't know. I don't know how the day unfolded. I didn't want to know.
Brett didn't tell you anything about how the day unfolded?
No, not detail by detail, no. I didn't want to know how the day unfolded.
What did he tell you?
The only thing he told me was that the car was gone. The car wasn't there anymore, and that he called me during the day and said, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I should kill her. And I said, no, you shouldn't. I said, but I don't want to know anything. I just don't, because that was not the plan. That was not the intention. The intention was just to keep her in that house during the day long enough for me to transfer money.
And did you transfer money?
Yes, I did.
How much monies did you transfer?
$880,000 into his sister's accounts.
His sister's who?
Courtney and Kelly.
Okay. Did you transfer any other monies besides $800,000?
Today I did.
How much was that?
$249,000 and $130,000 or $60,000, I believe.
And what account did you transfer that in?
Into Brett's accounts.
Into Brett's account.
Though it would have been smarter to remain silent until she had a lawyer, once Brett had told his version of the story, it was very likely she thought she needed to immediately respond. Brett told the detectives that Tracy had given him the order to kill. She didn't specifically say kill her, but she did say do it, and he claimed that that was intended to mean to kill her. She adamantly denied that she had any intention of killing Gail.
The information I'm getting is that you called Brett about 4 o'clock and said do it.
No, I never told him to do it.
You didn't?
No.
Okay, because, it's all on the table now,
No,
sweetheart.
I never told him to do it. I said,
Because, I'll be able to check that in the phone.
I know.
Okay.
I said, I don't want to know. And he did tell me about that he told me that he made her give him a blowjob. And that pissed me off. And I told him that was stupid, that he should not have done that. That should not have happened at all. And no, I never told him to do it.
So, which one? Brett told you that he made her give him a blowjob.
Yeah.
Okay. Did he say anything else about touching her?
No. I think he probably wouldn't have, because he knows I would have got mad. He wouldn't have.
Right, if he would have done that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
The only reason it's possible that she didn't want Gail killed was because they clearly weren't trying to cover their tracks. They deposited money into accounts in their names, and it would be obvious after the fact that Tracy had done it at work. They were planning to take the money and flee the country, so they might not have thought they needed to eliminate the witness. On the other hand, they weren't going to be able to leave right away. The bank transfers weren't noticed right away, so Gail would have been the only person who could have stopped them from taking off. It's her word against his, and it will likely never be known whose idea was to kill Gail. The other thing she mentioned was that Brett had forced Gail to give him a blowjob, which turned out to be true. The detective had asked him if he had sexually assaulted her, and he denied it. I think at the time of this interview, they had some information from the rape kit that was collected during Gail's autopsy. It usually takes some time to get an exact DNA match back from the lab, but they can do a simpler test to see if the DNA found is male or female. The swab that was used to collect fluid from inside Gail's mouth was found to have 2 DNA profiles in it, one male and one female. Obviously, the female DNA was Gail's. The other DNA profile would eventually come back a match for Brett, but at the time of these interviews, all they knew was that it belonged to a male, and from what they knew, there had been 2 men at Gail's house with her that day. So he had denied it, and they didn't have anything concrete yet that proved it was him, and they moved on. The statement from Tracy was the first time someone had actually claimed that Brett had sexually assaulted Gail. The other man that was at the house that day would back that up when he was later interviewed. Tracy went on to tell investigators that on the 5th, after work, she returned home and wanted to spend some time with her kids because she thought she wasn't going to see them for a while. She was basically abandoning her kids so she could live a life as a fugitive, but she'd have money to spend. I guess that was more important than her own children. Courtney had also been staying at her apartment, but when she got back home, Courtney was gone, so Tracy logged into her bank account and noticed she had already spent a lot of money. As soon as Courtney's name came up, investigators started looking for her. They were able to look at charges on her bank and see that she was staying at a hotel nearby. When they got there, they already had enough information to arrest her and bring her in for questioning.
I was come out, asked, and I agreed.
Okay, but you would come and ask about what?
And about if I would want to, if I would give everything up for $1 million.
Okay.
Or he said, you don't have anything going for you already or whatever, or you have nothing here to leave, right? Or, and...
You're talking about Brett?
Right.
Okay.
And, then he had told me about their idea or what they were thinking about doing.
And that was?
Getting the money and leaving.
Getting the money from who?
I really don't know from who.
You just knew they were getting that, and you say they, you mean who? Who's in they? Brett and Tracy?
And Tracy.
Okay.
But I don't know where it was coming from, how they were getting it, or where the money was coming from. I just knew that.
But you knew about a plan. Courtney, you knew about a plan that they were going to have to go over here to this lady's house. You knew about that already.
No, that was threw out there as an idea. There was so many ideas that were thrown out there that they were talking about, and I would always just be sitting there or riding in the back of the car or anything like that, and it was just kind of thrown out there. And
so
there were so many things jokingly and
right. The idea of going over to this lady's house, right, and doing what? What was part of that idea?
To go over there and hold her up. That's all I knew that was going to happen.
And do you know who this lady was?
No.
But you knew it was an employee of where Tracy works?
Yes.
You did know that?
Yeah. She was the manager or something. That's all I know. I don't know what she looks like or nothing.
Right.
I mean, I don't know where she lives. Nothing at all about her.
Mm-hmm.
Sadly, Courtney is barely present at the interview. Her brother said she had a drug problem, and he wasn't kidding. Her cognitive abilities are severely impaired, and it takes her a long time to come up with answers. She described being asked by Tracy and Brett if she wanted to take off with them in exchange for helping out with the embezzlement. Her part of the plan was to open bank accounts that the money would be transferred into, and their first plan to get passports encountered a hiccup. So she was instructed to go back to Atlanta on Friday the 5th to pick up Tracy's passport. I feel like it's safe to say that Courtney knew the least amount of details about the plan, if for no other reason than I don't think she was able to remember some of the finer details, but I don't think Tracy and Brett entrusted her with a lot. Courtney was simply focused on the money. Once the idea of having a ton of money got into her head, she was down for anything, and that showed in her behavior immediately after the crime.
So what all have you spent the money on? Because it was quite, like you said, it's quite a little spending spree.
Just stuff.
Like, what?
Just things from different stores here and there.
Well, it's quite a chunk. What were some big investments that you made?
The biggest was K Jewelers.
The most that you spent is $1,000?
No, it was.
It was how much?
I got 2 watches from there.
Okay. How much did that total up at?
It was like three something.
3 as in 3?
3,000.
3,000? Who's that other watch for?
Just for a friend.
Does he have that watch? Who has the watches?
They're at the hotel.
Okay.
She can't even remember. She spent $20,000 on a bunch of crap that she can't even remember, and a woman died for it. She and her boyfriend purchased watches the day after the murder. A woman died so they could steal money, and the first thing Courtney did was to buy 2 expensive watches. That was what was important to her. Then on the 7th, they returned to the K Jewelers, returned one of the watches, and purchased a different watch plus a $3,800 gold chain, putting their grand total for jewelry in the days after the murder at $6,368.87. She spent $1,300 on big speakers for her boyfriend's car. She paid for rooms at the Hilton, the Marriott, Wyndham, bought an iPad, a chainsaw, night vision goggles, a stun gun, a Samsung cell phone, tons of clothes, and of course, a suitcase for her upcoming travels. A detective would later describe Courtney being concerned when they took her purse, saying, quote, "Don't touch my makeup, it's expensive." It's sad when you find someone whose life so thoroughly revolves around stuff, but it's so much worse when someone's life is taken for it. Stuff. Just a bunch of random stuff. Though she was only a minor player in the plan, Courtney was charged with felony murder and sent to jail like Tracy and Brett. Now the investigators needed to find the 4th man who had helped with the crime. That man turned out to be 26-year-old Keith Anthony Dozier. He was tracked down on the evening of October 10th and was the last person interviewed about the murder. He was cooperative and polite, and he claimed that he had no involvement in the crime in any way. He said he was home all day Friday the 5th and that his wife could confirm that. No matter what the investigators said or did, he maintained his innocence. They showed him the lineup photos that they had used to identify him, but that didn't prove anything. It didn't take long for his alibi to fall apart, though.
All right, check this out. Talk to Shanice. Okay? She didn't see you Friday morning, bro. Alright? Let me show you something else. Who's this person right here?
That's me.
That's you. That's a photo lineup. Alright? Circle you picked out. Not only that, I got you on video at the banks with them. I'm just letting you know that now. Okay?
As soon as the detective said his wife didn't see him at home, Keith became adamant about wanting to talk to her, and there's a good reason for that. The detectives didn't want to let him call his wife because they had a feeling they knew what he wanted to do. They tried to get him to trade some information about his involvement in exchange for a call to his wife, and he went on to try and explain a surveillance picture of him at a bank with Brett prior to the murder. He said that Brett asked him to meet him there and told him to open a new account, but he didn't feel right about it and didn't end up opening any accounts. He said that Brett had asked him to participate in the embezzlement plan, but he said no. Eventually, the investigators relented and left the room so he could call his wife.
I told them that I didn't have no involvement with it, and they just said, well, we're charging you with murder. They're going to take me to the LEC. I have no idea where that's at. But like I said, we just gotta stick to our story, Shanice. We know the truth. I told them I was at home with you. They don't believe me. They keep saying, we know you're there and all sort of stuff. So, I guess we're going to have to try to get a lawyer, baby. And I said, we just have to stick with what we know. I'm at the house all day. All I do is, just fill out applications. And then it's me and you all day after you get off of work.
I think he knew that the room was being recorded and was trying very hard to influence his wife without coming right out and telling her to lie. The funny thing was that people had used that phone multiple times over the hours of interviews that happened in this case, and it was specifically set up so the handset didn't work and you could only use it on speakerphone. You think there might be a specific reason why that was? Oh, so they could hear everyone's conversation, and they did.
You're being recorded. Okay, I know you're not stupid. That's why you're real careful about what you say on the phone. Okay? And it's very clear. Anybody who watches this recording is going to see you going, hey, baby, got to stick to our story. Oh, it's not even a story. It's the truth. Hey, baby, this is what I told them. I told them this, this, and this. We just got to stick to that. Hey, baby.
They knew exactly what he was trying to do, and they used that to their advantage. The truth was that Keith's wife was at work on the morning of the 5th. She couldn't possibly confirm that he was home that morning. The detective told him that they would bring his wife to the station for an interview, and as soon as she claimed she saw him home all morning, they would arrest her for giving a false statement. Then they took a chance and claimed that there was a surveillance camera at the entrance to Tracy's apartment complex, and they had him on camera arriving to her apartment on his motorcycle and then in the back of Tracy's car as they left to go to Gail's house. I don't believe they had that, and fortunately Keith didn't ask them for specific times because I don't think they would have been able to tell him. But that supposed evidence and the fact that he didn't want to get his wife in trouble made him finally confess to being at Gail's house on the day of her murder.
I leave Friday morning. At first we couldn't find the house. And then we found it. We didn't know how to get in because they have a driveway. So parked around the corner from my house. Tracy said she was going to go up there and make sure that she's home. Tell her that she broke down or she was in the neighborhood or some shit. To get her let in the house. Then she was going to text us and let us know when the door was open.
Investigators would later find an email that Tracy had sent to Gail asking for her address. She claimed she needed it for when she sent out Christmas cards. It was a ruse to get her address because Tracy had no idea where she lived and had never been there before. She also had trouble finding the house, and Keith said it was because Gail didn't have a driveway, but she did. The front of Gail's house was directly on the street, but if you turned down the next road, you would get to an alleyway behind Gail and her neighbors' houses where they had driveways and garages. Another thing Tracy would have known if she had been to Gail's house before. Tracy knocked on Gail's door and she asked if she could use her phone, probably telling Gail her cell phone had died. When she went inside, Tracy made sure the front door remained unlocked. Brett and Keith walked into the house after her.
We went in. I went down the hallway to make sure nobody else was there. Gave Brett the go ahead. Brett went in there, he grabbed her. And, you know what I'm saying, he put a gun to her face and told her not to say anything, don't scream or nothing. Then Tracy walked out. He got duct taped. Tied her up. Brett didn't say anything about killing anybody. Nobody said anything about killing anybody. Okay.
Alright, so Tracy was telling the truth then.
Okay. Brett comes to me, he's like, bro, don't come in the room. And I was like, why? He's like, just don't come in the room, just give me like 5 minutes. I was like, okay. About 5 Maybe 10 minutes go by. He comes back out. He's like, alright, it's cool. Brett would get a phone call. And, you know what I'm saying, he'll turn on the water in the bathroom, and then he'll go into the other room, and he'll talk. And then, you know, I'll watch her, and then I'll walk back there, and I'm like, what's going on? And he's talking to someone, he's like, I might have to kill her. And I'm like, kill who? For what? And he's like, bro, I made her suck my dick. And I was like, why would you do something that stupid?
Keith was the second person to confirm that Brett had sexually assaulted Gail. He also told the investigators that Tracy had never said anything about killing Gail. Of course, they might have left him in the dark about that part since he was a bit of an outsider. There was no record of him having gotten a passport, and it seems as though he wasn't planning to leave the country with the other three. He went on to say that Brett went into the bedroom with Gail by himself and tried to strangle her to death but didn't succeed. He got Gail to pass out but apparently wasn't able to kill her, so he went into the kitchen, got some garbage bags, and went back into the bedroom. Brett had claimed that they suffocated Gail together, but according to Keith, Brett acted alone. Again, impossible to confirm whose story is true, but Brett ends up looking more and more like a psychopath once the entire story is finally revealed. Keith's story also differed from Brett's because he described going through Gail's belongings looking for stuff to steal. Brett claimed they didn't take anything, but Keith said that Brett took the hydrocodone that had been in the bottles in Gail's bathroom. It was during that time that they found the gun that was left in the bathroom of Gail's house. Before we finish this episode, I just want to remind you that we're trying to hit 1 million subscribers this year, so before you go, take a minute to subscribe to the channel. Even better, tell someone else about the channel so they can subscribe as well. Then make sure you both turn on notifications so you always know when a new episode airs. You can also support the channel by checking out our merch at thisismonsters.com. A link is in the description. Your support is appreciated. Tracy Jones and Brett Kelly pleaded guilty to felony murder plus a number of other charges and were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Courtney Kelly pleaded guilty to felony murder and some other charges and was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. Keith Dozier chose to plead not guilty and take his chances with a jury. There was no question that he was involved in the crime, but he didn't want to be sentenced for murder, and he tried to convince a jury that his involvement didn't justify a murder conviction. The jury deliberated for 3.5 hours before finding him guilty on all counts. Keith Dozier was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The bank transfer process happened at the offices of Pinkston and Associates, and in order to use the system, Tracy needed a security key fob in order to log in. Tracy was under the impression that she had to log in from Gail's computer, but in a later interview, Calder Pinkston said that, with the key fob, Tracy could have logged into the system from anywhere. She could have done it from home, not needing to keep Gail away from the office and not unleashing a monster on her that fateful day. Whether or not Tracy wanted Gail murdered, whether or not Brett suffocated her alone or had help from Keith, all 4 of these people decided that someone's life was less important than the ability to surround themselves with material possessions purchased with money they didn't work for. Monsters commit a variety of crimes from murder to rape to kidnap, but it seems like the most common trait is sheer laziness. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.